Welcome, everyone, to another episode of ALN Thursday at 4. This week is very interesting. We've got Shelly Culbertson from the RAND Corporation and Shelly Culbertson from our very own Rich Culbertson. And before we get started, I want to thank our patron sponsors, ABS Quality Evaluations and ABS Group, Onuma System, and all of our organizational members. Without all of the support we get, we cannot do programs like this and plan for the upcoming 2021 Asset Leadership Event, which will be going from October 12th through November 12th. Look for details coming up on that. And next week, we will have our first ALN Thursday at 4 guest, Jack Kelly, back, and he'll say what it's been like watching ALN Thursday at 4 for a year has been. And he's involved in the ISO 55,000 rewrite, so he'll be making comments about that too. And just a couple procedural issues. I am flying solo today, so if all questions could be put into the chat section, that would be easiest. And want to try to make this as easy as possible. And we might ask some people to come on and be a special guest towards the end, but we'll surprise Shelly with that later. So thank you, Shelly, for joining us. Your father, Rich, had said you had some excellent reports that you had done with RAND. He said were relevant to asset management, and I looked at them, and indeed they were. Usually we start with the question about how did you get to this point in your asset management journey? Since you're not really focused in asset management, can you just give us a little biographical background on how you got to RAND Corporation and focus in these areas that you're focused in?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much for inviting me, Mike. I'm honored and delighted to be here. So I'm Shelly Culbertson. I'm a senior researcher at the RAND Corporation and associate director of our disaster research and analysis program. And I have been at RAND for a number of years. I've spent about half of my time at RAND working in the Middle East, working on international development and working with places that were post-conflict, so Iraq and some of the countries surrounding Syria dealing with refugees. And then in recent years, I've been based in Pittsburgh, where I transitioned some of the international development work into disaster recovery work, as there are a lot of overlaps between post-conflict recovery and disasters as well. So per our discussion, I'm happy to talk about some work that we've been doing in the past couple of years in the Caribbean after Hurricanes Irma and Maria, which were in 2017, and the havoc that they wreaked on Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands in particular. I think something that has been interesting about those studies is that while we were not looking at standards specifically as part of the studies were about looking holistically at how these societies and islands in totality could recover. Standards did come up in a number of places and seem to be a key part of that recovery. So I'm happy to talk about some of those issues.
Yes, the government upheaval overlapping with natural disasters makes perfect sense. And to tell you the truth, then that overlapping with asset management kind of makes sense also. If you have asset management in place properly, then when disaster strikes, you are more ready to recover, at least in theory from what I've seen. And I would think the same thing goes for governmental upheaval too. You know, it's better to have a government be upheaved if all the assets are being managed properly. And hey, maybe there isn't even upheaval if there is proper asset management going on. But this isn't a theological discussion. This is more practical. So will you tell us a little bit about what you found in your research on the disaster recovery?
Sure. So I have worked on and led parts of two studies. So the first was the disaster recovery plan for the U.S. Virgin Islands, and then the second was looking at how municipalities in Puerto Rico can recover. And I think a common issue in both places was that there were tremendous challenges with public development, infrastructure degradation, not following continental U.S. standards, and some economic challenges prior to the disasters. That when disasters struck, they were less able to recover or to be resilient than if they'd had those circumstances in place. And I think some of the interesting things that were coming out of this were that a lot of different types of buildings or public service infrastructure, roads, electricity, wastewater, et cetera, hadn't really been up to continental US standards prior to the hurricanes. And so after the hurricanes, the disaster recovery plans included efforts to try to not only get them back to where they were, but to get them up to what are now continental United States standards. And a lot of those standards that, if they had been in place and had been followed, would make such places more resilient to hurricane destruction in the first place. So for instance, the upgrades to the types of roads that they were using would make them be able to withstand higher levels of storms and then not have those same types of issues. So it's been interesting seeing how building standards and management standards have evolved over time, that if they had been in place prior to the hurricanes, there could have been somewhat less of levels of destruction. I think another area where standards were really coming into play were in the capabilities of local communities or municipalities to be able to manage processes. I think so. So one of the challenges with a disaster is that not only is there tremendous physical destruction, but then the people who are central to managing the recovery from that destruction also have had personal destruction. Their homes are destroyed. Sometimes their offices are destroyed. They work out of their cars. Their office buildings are moldy. They may be traumatized. There are a lot of reasons why that process is difficult. In addition, a lot of those communities that get hit by disasters, their day-to-day operations are not centered on managing capital projects. They might manage maintenance and repair and have certain projects in place, but now suddenly, once they've been at the forefront of disaster, they have to manage massive capital projects. So, for example, Puerto Rico had $90 billion worth of destruction. The U.S. Virgin Islands had $11 billion of destruction. So imagine tiny little communities that maybe they maintain their roads every once in a while. Now they have to manage huge capital projects, and many times the processes for managing those aren't in place. So every individual municipality needs to almost reinvent the wheel and coming up with procurement standards, finance, contracting, all of these things. And some of our recommendations were about how if they were able to get some island-wide standards, that would really reduce the burden off of these traumatized people who have so much on their plate and have to reinvent the wheel to do all of these things. So I think there's a really nice overlap between having some of these processes in place that could reduce a lot of burden on communities recovering from disasters.
Yeah, and then you said they might be traumatized, but people may be hospitalized or even dead. So your workforce is now totally different than it had been. So
yeah, the workforce is totally different because both in the Virgin Islands and in Puerto Rico, there was fast out-migration of people. People looked at the economy, they had a hard time getting jobs, they looked at the destruction, they didn't want to be there. So Puerto Rico had some 500,000 people leave. Some of those came back. And Virgin Islands had somewhat similar proportion, maybe 15% or so, at least according to some of their school data, that left. So the workforce is different because people are leaving, first of all. Next, it's hard for them to put energy into recovering their community, when they're going home and they're living with a blue tarp over their roof, or even after the blue tarp is gone, the electricity might not be there, or maybe their cousins had lost their home and moved in, and now you've got multifamily homes. So there are a lot of reasons why there's just a tremendous amount of stress. That's a second reason why the workforce is different. And then in addition, the skills that are needed to rebuild and in the numbers needed may not be there. So the Virgin Islands, for instance, we did some modeling of workforce requirements, and they needed a lot more workers than they had. And even if they took all the unemployed people on the islands and got them trained up, they still wouldn't have enough construction workers, managers, all the types of skills that you would need to be able to manage these large complex processes. And so then we have to start thinking about importing them. So the disaster recovery just is reliant on all these very different types of systems that all have to be working together and in place, all while the people who are required to do this work may not be able to function at their best because of their own personal circumstances.
So part of your findings were to try to assist, well, we had talked previously, you said one of the things that the municipalities were doing, and you just noted that they all are reinventing the wheel. So some kind of standardized processes for procurement, municipal procurement, could be beneficial. And if it's beneficial for these island communities, it could probably very well be good for our counties, our states to be doing some of the same type of thing.
I think so, absolutely apt. So while our studies were focused on the Caribbean because of the tremendous amount of destruction there, and these are American territories, et cetera, as part of this work, we also did interviews with a number of state and local government officials who had managed disasters, whether in Louisiana or New York from Hurricane Sandy, or just really around the country, and often heard the same things, that from their perspective, they get hit by a disaster. Now all of a sudden they can't function at their best, and they have huge amounts of additional responsibilities that are placed on them. And then I remember we have a quote in one of our reports, but one of the state officials said, "I wish someone had just handed me this war Bible that had all the stuff we needed in one book with sets of templates and contracts and checklists and all these things to do, so they didn't have to go and figure it out on their own." Because the last thing you want to be doing when your house is destroyed and your building's destroyed and you're the one who has to go manage recovery is have to figure all this stuff out from scratch, when some of those things should just be readily maybe replicable across disaster-prone communities. And I actually think that this is an idea that's probably generalizable to disaster-prone or afflicted communities really across the United States, whether that's hurricanes, floods, wildfires. They get into the same situation and they think that they're the only ones this has ever happened to, and have to reinvent the wheel because they just don't know what to do or what the processes or standards are. And so having some materials along those lines for disasters could probably be a very useful addition.
Did you find in your studies that FEMA had any of this in place, or was it easier for FEMA to do that type of standard work in the mainland, but it was harder on islands? Or I would think FEMA would be on that.
So FEMA does have a number of standards and processes. They're also more focused on their own internal processes, and they've got volumes and volumes of books and guidelines, et cetera. So they have that. But really on I think some of the issues are more on the applicant side, or the applicant meaning the state and local entities that have been hit by disasters. They're the ones that are often struggling. At the same time, I think one of the things that we noted was that FEMA's processes can be so complex that if you're a community hit by a disaster, having to navigate all of that can be quite challenging. And so there's an element of complexity in those operations that can add to some of the challenges.
I think we're establishing a new call for the Asset Leadership Network, is to assist FEMA in establishing, using a standardized process that would help people before and after disasters. FEMA might as well start helping people before disasters occur, because we're seeing them increase. And if we can get the message out, lessons learned, like you've done, and Houston's been flooded so much that, they've probably have something close to a playbook that could be used by other flooded communities. But that's just me speculating. So part of the process is, recovery process is insurance claims. And we have a question about standardization would probably help streamline insurance claims. Did you look into how people were able to deal with the insurance claims? That's kind of hard process to be doing when your house is flooded or burnt or whatever.
Yeah, and insurance issues are really interesting in I think in the Caribbean in disasters and probably elsewhere, but I can speak mainly to the situation in the American Caribbean, where FEMA is viewing itself as the funder of last resort. So what's supposed to happen is that homes and offices and businesses are insured. And then after insurance claims have been paid out, then federal funding. That process can work quite well in a number of circumstances and so forth. Some insurance companies in coastal areas have been pushing back on the idea of insuring places that have these high risks. But there are a number of challenges also with relying entirely on insurance, or ways that make that somewhat incomplete. So in some cases, and particularly in some lower income communities, homes were either not insured or underinsured. And so people who were facing disasters may not have had the full insurance needed to be able to cover that. The same thing would often happen with public buildings as well. So even with the public buildings, for instance, in Puerto Rico, we found that often the ownership of the public buildings was not known, and buildings with paper documents, perhaps from hundreds of years ago or even tens of years ago, they could be destroyed, or maybe those records just didn't exist. So even figuring out, was it the central government of Puerto Rico? Was it the municipality? Was it who owned a building, to be able to then process insurance claims or to get federal assistance? So documenting some of the ownership issues could often get in the way. And the same thing would happen with individuals with home insurance. So often the system works very well, you get insurance payments. In other cases, people might have lived on land for generations and not have had deeds, and would have had a very difficult time proving ownership in order to be able to get insurance, or maybe they didn't have it. Or in many cases also in Puerto Rico, communities could settle without ownership deeds on certain lands. But sometimes those lands were flood prone. And so if a flood hit and there was no proof of ownership, those people still were out of a house, but the insurance would not necessarily have been available. So it ends up being somewhat of a complex system that works. When it works well. And then in other cases, there's some gaps.
So again, asset management prior would be beneficial. So the governing body, if there is any way that they could assist people in securing and having the documentation, then when disaster occurs, there's some record of ownership, and be able to avoid some of the common problems that you've noted in your reports.
Yeah, actually, it's a bit of a tangent, but comparing that to, say, post-conflict recovery, some colleagues and I also did a study on recovery of the city of Mosul in Iraq after the battle against ISIS. And this was also coming up as an issue. Property, with all of the destruction, people moving around, property records could be lost. And then if somebody wanted to either move back into a home or qualify for UN or government assistance, they often wouldn't have any documentation that this was their particular home. And so the property records would often be quite complex and get in the way of recovery. And in that case in particular, ISIS went into the city and they destroyed the building that had all of the property records. And then they would often confiscate homes and so forth, and then either give them to supporters or sell them for revenue. And so this issue of how do you deal with property claims after a disaster or a war becomes quite complex, and there are a lot of similarities. And it's odd when you can look at the American Caribbean and Iraq and look at some similar issues.
Yeah, and it's strange to think, in these very old societies that digitalization of the records would be helpful, but we claim that data is an asset, and that sounds like if you manage it beforehand by digitizing it and keeping it on the cloud, they could destroy the original, but that would be okay. It seems weird to think that asset management is playing a role in post-conflict recovery, but I think there's a case to be made for that.
Yeah, I think that's very accurate. That being able to have updated data and property records and other types of records are really key. And it's interesting you mentioned data as well in the context of recovery. So some of our reports have found that there really aren't good standard metrics and then data collection to support the metrics for recoveries. And so that's something that's also very, very much needed. So we recommended that for both Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, developing a set of targets and goals, metrics to measure those, and then developing systems so that data is systematically collected so that can be tracked. But I think that's also something that is probably a general issue as well, but or at least it's not necessarily consistent in a lot of disasters, is that what is counted as success and what is measured in the data that's collected to try to understand where you are along that journey can be inconsistent as well.
I was talking yesterday with someone who looks to be a new member, Mary Adams, who is president of Smarter Companies, and we were talking about the complexity of the issues that we're facing, and it seems almost impossible or untenable. However, it is possible to address these issues. It is possible to learn from the disasters and the conflict areas so that flooded areas in Iowa and along the Mississippi can claim their land rights properly. It's not easy, but these standardization of processes can be helpful in solving the problems. Cecilia Moa.
Respond to that in the sense that I think often after a disaster that people look around at the levels of destruction and it certainly looks impossible, but societies do recover. And I think the question is, how can it be done more quickly and more efficiently? So we looked at a length of time for recovery, and say Hurricane Sandy in New York, tremendous capacity for recovery. They were able to do a lot of that work in 7 to 10 years and spend out a lot of the recovery funds during that time. In Louisiana, after Hurricane Katrina, that process, instead, when you look at the data of construction projects and when funding was spent, was more like 15 to 20 years. And Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands are a little bit behind that. So these are long processes. So they do show that it's possible because they're finite, but that's a long time. That's a really long time to live in a place that takes many years to recover. I think there are sometimes opportunities though to make it better. In the Virgin Islands, one thing that was interesting was that many of their school buildings had been destroyed. But the school buildings were often, built in the 1950s or so, and they weren't up to hurricane standards, and they weren't in line with modern pedagogical standards. The school buildings were not designed to be in a way that supports more modern methods of managing education. So the school system in the Virgin Islands, instead of rebuilding right away, what they did was they put a pause on it, and they worked with the American Association of Architecture to come up with their own set of school standards before starting the rebuilding process. And the school standards were meant to be hurricane resistant, recognizing that you want the building to last, but also that in a hurricane, people will often use schools as community centers where they'll take shelter. So it means they need to be pretty special in terms of being able to resist hurricanes and have, manage energy, et cetera. But then at the same time, reorganize the structure and the use of space so that it's better supportive of educational purposes. So I think that sometimes, I guess this is also going back to the idea of possible versus impossible. There can be better things that come out of it, but it's pretty I think stressful and frustrating to be living through that process while you're waiting for it to finish.
Yeah. So Cecilia Mowat, president of Strategy Insight, is asking about a holistic approach to collaboration that occurred in the recovery. Did you see things that worked in terms of the relationships? Were they strong before the disaster, and because they were strong before the disaster, they were able to achieve things? Or was it the human thing? Jim Dieter, our CEO, has said, when there's a problem, people come together. They forget their differences and just recognize that person needs help, and they help people. And when the storm is over, then they go back to their separate ways. Did you see in your reporting that integrated communities recovered better?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that does end up being somewhat inspiring about looking at disasters. There's so much destruction and anguish, but at the same time, humanity comes out. People take in their friends and relatives into their homes to live for months if their homes had been destroyed. So people help each other. I think more from an institutional perspective, there were a lot of community groups that really stepped up to try to work together, and you could see variation in this, where some of the islands, the Virgin Islands, had less of a community organization presence, and others had more of that. And the ones that had more of a community organization, they were better able to go out to individual homeowners, provide information, provide assistance, kind of grease the wheels and make things run a little bit better. So having this I guess the holistic group of stakeholders helping, from individuals help themselves, of course, but the territory government, the Virgin Islands or the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, the federal government, multiple federal agencies, but then the community groups that would organize and either channel donations or facilitate some of these processes. So the community aspect, I agree with the questioner, is particularly important.
So I told you ahead of time that 30 minutes was going to fly by. We're almost there. I'm going to thank our sponsors again very quickly, and then I'm hoping you can stay overtime, because I've made Rich Culbertson able to speak, and I wanted him to be able to ask you some questions, so that, because he knows why he wanted you to be a guest, and he might have some things that are more specific than what I've been asking. So thank you again, Shelley, and ABS.
Mike, I've been delighted to be here and have an interesting discussion with you.
And organizational members, and then next week, Jack Kelly. So I'll wait. I forgot to start sharing the screen, so we're going to do this all over again. 1 second. Okay. So there's the patron sponsors. Thanks to them. Here's our organizational members. And next week, I'm really looking forward to hearing from Jack Kelly a year after the first ALN Thursday at 4 program. So, Rich, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you too. How are you doing in Reno? So, Shelley, I forgot to let everyone know you're in Pittsburgh, and Rich is at the National Property Management Association National Education Seminar in Reno. And Rich, you say it's smoky there?
Yeah, it was a little smoky over the last couple of days, and so you can smell disaster, you might say. But
Ah,
I think, though, that when Shelley was growing up, I've always made sure that she had all these asset management experiences, such as moving from place to place. Also, when she's about 14, I sent Shelley and her brother out to California to paint a house.
that is hands-on asset
On
management.
asset management. And that has grown into some of her current activities because she's a landlady too.
Okay,
So
you learned well.
She's learned well.
So-
One experience we also had is that when Shelley was writing a book, one of the things she wanted to do is go to Egypt. Well, I wanted to go to Egypt too, but we had different objectives. She was looking, how societies went as far as after I guess the term is how they were adjusting, and I was looking at asset management. So we shared times of this is an asset management shot, or this is another shot of how societies were evolving in the Mideast.
Mm-hmm. So, Shelley, what did you learn from your father about asset management? Anything kind of seep in? Does he talk about ISO 55000 at the dinner table?
He does indeed talk about ISO 55000 at the dinner table. So while I don't work on asset management, I do appreciate it, and I do think one important concept has been the idea that not all assets are tangible; they could be intangible, and making sure that there are processes in place. And I think that's an interesting idea when thinking about disasters as well. That a big asset is having steps and processes in place so that people in distress don't have to reinvent the wheel. So I think that's a nice concept.
Excellent. So, Rich, Mary Adams is on the call, and I look forward to introducing you to her. She has a career in knowledge management, which is intangible asset management, and we'll talk about that more later. So,
I've always had a large amount of interest in knowledge management because I always thought that was also, in fact, a good intangible asset.
So, Shelley, you found that was an important aspect of successful recovery that you reported on?
Yeah, I think well, we recommended having standards and processes in place, and I think that that's a similar concept.
That is knowledge.
Shelley, you've been involved in intangible asset management as far as education, correct?
I don't know what you mean, Dad.
Shelley, for a long time, would sneak over to Iraq because she had some contracts there about the educational system in what city was that, Shelley?
Yeah, so I did about 5 years of work going back and forth in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. We worked, had contracts with the Kurdistan regional government, and they wanted to develop a plan to get all kids in school up through 9th grade. And that involves a number of aspects. One of them was figuring out how to get enough school buildings. So we did modeling of the number of school buildings that would be needed, along with numbers of teachers, and looked at those issues. And similarly, a lot of issues with buildings and school infrastructure and so forth.
One thing she didn't tell her mother was she was in the green zone.
That's another important aspect of knowledge management is don't get your mother worried about things that she does not need to worry about.
Exactly.
And she didn't tell her mother about the bodyguard she had to go when she went over to Iraq.
Well, I'm glad you had that because you're an important asset to be managed also. No, that's not right. We're trying to get away from using the word asset related to human beings. We're going to work on that. So your book that you wrote, I think, you said it was a tangent to talk about conflict recovery. I don't think so. I think it's directly tied. Can you tell us a little bit about the book?
Yeah, so I wrote a book in so I read a lot of Rand reports. I wrote a commercial book in 2016, and it was looking at how the Arab Spring changed the Middle East. And it's not an academic book, so I hope anybody who's listening might like to read it and enjoy it. But it's a narrative of a journey through 6 countries that had experienced the Arab Spring, and then using the journey as a means to try to reflect on the political changes and the history and how the place just feels and so forth. So I had a lot of fun writing the book. It included discussion of Tunisia, which was the first country to have the government overthrow. So Tunisia, Turkey, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, and Qatar. Yeah, it was a wonderful and fun and interesting book to write, although I think its conclusions were somewhat tempered in the sense that the Middle East these challenges will take a long time and probably several decades to resolve.
Yeah, we're seeing the reversal of much of the gains that occurred. Currently, it's not as pleasant there as the promise was.
Yeah, after the Arab Spring, the hopeful protests led to 4 civil wars or government overthrows, and Tunisia, which had been perhaps the most promising success story, is also seeing some instability right now with additional pressures from COVID on the economy and so forth. So I think many countries in the Middle East are struggling. I think we've been fortunate enough in the United States and parts of Western Europe to have had subsidies to help people who lost their jobs or who were struggling financially get through COVID and have a safety net. The Middle East many countries hadn't been able to do that as well and had economies shrink, and so those people are really struggling in a lot of ways.
That's hard to see. So your trip with your father to Egypt was part of the research for that book?
Yeah, very fun. Yeah, I wanted a travel companion. So my dad came to Egypt, and we traveled through Egypt, and I did interviews, and my dad took pictures, and then he created a slide presentation called Asset Management in Egypt, which is his trip photos, and it was very fun.
Yes, I actually worked with him on getting that presentation into shape, and it was a little bit of arm wrestling. Yeah. We got it to a point where I think it is valuable and meaningful, but Rich kind of lost interest after I had to beat it into shape, and I think I've maybe beat him a little too hard.
That was fine. It's a good experience and a good memory and something that's documented.
Actually, it's really what formed the foundation of our relationship, Rich.
Yeah, it sure was. Yes.
Yeah. So then you traveled to the 5 other countries also?
Yeah. So Tunisia, Turkey, Jordan, Qatar, and I'm missing one. Iraq. Yes. Yeah, but I had been doing work in many of those countries prior to that, and then or had lived there as a student or spent a lot of time traveling. So that was after a lot of years spent in the Middle East.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for bringing all of your experience to our audience, and really appreciated this conversation. And thank you, Rich, for recommending that we talk to Shelley, and we'll keep her abreast of ISO 55000 and asset management developments in case it ever is of assistance to her in any way.
Well, I think she knows more about asset management than she lets on.
Ah.
Well, thank you for the kind invitation and the really interesting discussion.
And hopefully we'll have you back maybe as part of a panel. I could see us eventually, talking more about disaster recovery and how to prepare for it. That could be a real good, meaningful panel. So we'll keep you in mind. And thanks, Rich, for jumping in. And thank you to the audience for attending and sticking around. Appreciate your interest. And we'll see you all next week.
Thank you all.
Bye for now.
Mike. Thank you, Dad.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.